Good afternoon and welcome back to the seminar. We will now begin the technical session 1, which is on biodiversity beyond protected areas, new perspectives for conservation. And the session chair for this is Dr. Eklavya Sharma. We have 1 plenary talk and we have 3 invited talks for this session. So I will now hand over the session to Dr. Eklavya Sharma. Sir, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sarala Kaling. Very good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this session 1. And this session is very, very important in a sense that all these years we have mostly talked about conservation very much within the protected area framework. But time has come that we move beyond protected areas with new perspective of conservation for biodiversity. And we have eminent speakers here. I'm going to introduce them one by one as we move, 4 of them, 1 plenary talk and 3 invited talks. For the plenary talk, we have 30 minutes, and for the invited talks, we have 20 minutes each. This is what we have. We have speakers like Professor Prasad Chaudhury from Nepal, who will be giving a plenary talk. Then we have Dr. Ganesan. Then we have Dr. T.R. Shankaraman, then we have Dr. Lila Nath Sharma from Nepal, and I think this session would certainly give us an opportunity to look conservation efforts, conservation possibilities outside the protected areas. So if we look at the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, nearly 39% of our area is protected area. So huge areas, and that is because a large area in Tibetan Plateau in China is actually under protected area management. So this is because of that you see this significant large value. But now looking into the southern part of the Himalayan region, there also we have a good percentage of coverage of protected areas. So, and in protected areas, we do have very interesting level of protection. So right from strict nature reserve, we have, which is, I mean, you are not allowed to even take a small leaf out of the that protected area for research also. From that, then you have different levels of protection, and now things have moved to biosphere reserves and beyond, also buffer zones where you can have lots of human and tourism activities in buffer zones. So you can imagine that as the time passed, the protected areas also got liberalized, I would say, and more inclusion of people's action in protected areas. So with that context in mind, not keeping just the protected areas, but what happens outside the protected area is quite important. So I will sum up later on, but to really start the proceedings, what I would like to do is I would like to introduce the plenary talk speaker, Professor Ram Chaudhury. And he will be speaking first. Professor Chaudhury is personally known to me for many, many, many years. I remember him. He's an emeritus professor right now as in Tribhuvan University in Nepal. He has 43 years of experience in teaching, research, and academic administration also. So he was executive director of Research Institute in Tribhuvan University. He has served as member National Planning Commission. I remember those days very much, Professor Chaudhury, when you were a member National Planning Commission. I had joined ICIMOD. So that is the first time when we interacted, because you were also a part of the ICIMOD Board of Governors. And I remember you chaired one of the Board of Governors session also in ICIMOD. So that was quite important for ICIMOD also, and your role not only in Nepal but broadening the horizon to the 8 Hindu Kush Himalayan countries. I also remember that you had a very strong research appellation in Europe. And I remember very much one with Bergen University, very much in Norway, was the one whenever I used to visit there. So there was a lot of mention of your name. So you also were trustee, National Trust for Nature Conservation. Then professor contributed lots of policy formulation for government of Nepal in biodiversity and environment. I remember you putting a document together for government of Nepal, NBSAP, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, if I remember correctly. So, and that action plan, actually, I took to Montreal, Canada, and handed over to the CBD, Conventional Biological Diversity Executive Secretary, the director. So I remember that also very much, and that document was prepared by you. So Professor Chaudhury has many awards, 28 awards and medals. Then he has led 28 research projects, supervised 5 PhD scholars, and over 60 master theses. He is the fellow of the World Academy of Sciences TWAS, which is quite important. And he was a coordinating lead author of Sustainable Use of Wild Species in IPBS, Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And I would also like to mention, since this conference is also talking, or seminar is talking about landscape approach, Professor Ram Chaudhury was one of the key partner and investigator in transboundary landscape program in Kailash transboundary landscape, which was implemented between India, Nepal, and China in the far western part of Nepal. So with this, Professor Chaudhury, the floor is yours, and you have 30 minutes for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lila Sharma. May I share the screen?
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lila Sharma, the chair of this session, for your generous remarks and introduction about me. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, distinguished guests, all participants for this opportunity. So this afternoon, I will be talking about biodiversity conservation in Nepal, Himalaya, landscape approach and socio-ecological perspectives, where I will be highlighting two things: how landscape approach play a key role in conserving biodiversity of the Himalayas beyond protected areas, number one, and number two, how socio-ecological component contribute to biodiversity conservation in the Himalayas at a spatial scale. So with this objective, I would like to begin my talk. So the outline of my presentation will be very simple and very small, but then Dr. Lila Sharma has pointed out so many things which I can skip. So biodiversity, concept and historical aspect, then biodiversity heritage of Nepal, a little bit about the approach to conservation, what are the major drivers that Dr. Sharma has already mentioned, conservation and management practices, and then conservation, development, and human well-being. What is the correlation, interrelationship? Then if-based conceptual framework, and then take-home message, and finally I will come to the conclusion. With this, I can't. Yes. So Himalayan mountains are islands of biodiversity. Then mountains have one feature, that is ecological factors are greatly compressed, but not all mountain ecosystems are same, because Himalaya is different from other mountain ecosystem, Rocky Mountains or Andes or others, but they have two things in common. One is that altitudinal diversity, altitudinal gradient, and the diversity. Then the definition of biodiversity by CBD tells us that it is the variety and variability among living organisms from all sources. So the basic thing here is that emphasis is on biodiversity is the variety of life. But in other words, this is also expression of quality of life. As Peter Raven has made a remarks that biodiversity keeps the planet habitable. In the same way, Edward Wilson talks about biologists who explore biodiversity see it vanishing before their eyes. So this is how we define biodiversity. But then biological resources are the resources of their actual or potential use, or values to humans and livelihoods for people, in particular, indigenous peoples and local communities. It is a matter of very important for economic development and prosperity. So those biological resources. With this, when we study biodiversity, we study at 3 levels: ecosystem diversity, organismal diversity, and genetic diversity. Among all those levels, all those elements, ecosystem in ecological diversity, species in organismal diversity, and genes in genetic diversity are very important to study. Objective of biodiversity and vision of the CBD clearly tells that conservation, sustainable use, and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the genetic resources are key things. But then the vision is that by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people, which Dr. Sharma already talked about. So biodiversity has become a focal point of economic interest because biodiversity is used for bioprospecting and commercial use of genetic diversity. It has also become a focal point for ecological and environmental interest, ecological and environmental studies, because we study environmental problems, we study extinction rates of the species and ecosystems, and also genetic resources. It has also political interest because international legal instruments, they are binding to all countries to come up with political interest and economic aspect of the biodiversity for its conservation, preservation. Biodiversity has another very important value, symbolic uses of biodiversity. Because when you talk about symbolic uses of biodiversity, it talks about that it has been used, for example, in several kinds of expressions, like this is Leontopodium alpinum that occurs in Europe, and it has been used as a image in several things like coin, like aeroplane, like pendant, and so on, as a beer or even postcard and other things. But also in our region, rhododendron arboreum is national flower of Nepal, like red panda is animal of state of Sikkim. But also it has other symbolic value. It gives opportunity to pay high reputation to several scientists. This is one of the examples, Chaudhury Chaudhury, which was named by my colleagues. So biodiversity means so many things. What biodiversity means these days: molecular biology, ecology and exploratory biology, biomolecular science, bioscience. So find your department where you are. Late Edward Winsell, called the new Darwin, animal ecologist, sociobiologist. He was one of the greatest biologists in the company of Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. So the term biodiversity was coined accidentally. The contracted form of biodiversity was coined by Walter Rosen in 1985, and then in the conference in 1986, and the proceedings that came out or edited by Edward Wilson that popularized biodiversity. But then the word is new because in historical aspect, we find biodiversity in several Hindu literatures like Rig Veda, Atharva Veda. They are all very old literatures, Mahabharata and Purans, Ramayana, Sursuta Samhita, Charak Samhita, and so on. So this is important to understand that this we keep Hindu literatures very strong for biodiversity. Not only there, but in Christian literature, there are several aspects of mention of in Christian Bible, aloe vera, pomegranates uses, in Muslim literatures, Holy Quran, where it talks about camphor, henna tree, and so on, in traditional Chinese medicine, 500 before Christ. So something like 13,000 medicinal plants have been used in traditional Chinese medicine. Over 100,000 medicinal prescriptions are recommended. So this is what we understand biodiversity in different literatures. From Buddha's perspective, biodiversity is seen as providing ecosystem services, like the forest is a peculiar organism of unlimited kindness and benevolence that makes no demand for its sustenance and extends generously the products of its life activity. It affords protection to all beings, offering shade even to X-men who destroy it. This is what Gautam Buddha mentioned. But also in traditional culture here, traditional ecological knowledge, forest ecosystem is considered a very precious resources. This is an old Limbu saying. Limbu ethnic group who lives in Nepal and Indian part also. Ghar odar ho, ban bhandar ho. I think you understand Nepali. So it means that the house is a shelter, whereas the forest is a storehouse. Biodiversity and ecosystem services. We provide biodiversity provides several ecosystem services like provisioning services. We find food, water, then regulating services, stabilize ecosystem services, water storage, supporting system services like soil formation, nutrient cycling, cultural services like recreational, spiritual, religious, and cultural identity. So biodiversity is the basis and the engine for all ecosystem services. So what is crucial question? Not whether to conserve biodiversity, not why to conserve biodiversity, but the best, how can we best conserve biodiversity at different levels at which conservation and development issues are being addressed together. So this is the major question that also was highlighted by Dr. Lila Sharma. Biodiversity heritage of Nepal. So among 36 hotspots, biodiversity of Nepal is very rich, a meeting point of 6 phytogeographic regions, but also global distribution of plant species richness in a recent paper in 2021 by ATREE. So he mentions that there are 20 centers of highest species richness. And here we can see that in the Himalayan region, so Sikkim both and Nepal Himalaya, and all those Himalayas are having rich biodiversity. So just to compare and give a flavor of Nepal and Sikkim biodiversity, the area of Nepal is almost 2 times higher. Total number of flowering plants is about 6,500 to 7,000 in Nepal, whereas 4,500 to 4,900. Orchidaceae, both in cases, very highest species richness, Poaceae, Asteraceae, Saperaceae, Fabaceae, they're all very highly species richness families. Diversity in the Himalayan region, diversity at ecosystem and species level. There are 60 ecoregions types in the Himalayas, 346 protected areas, 1,106 important biodiversity areas, 53 important plant areas, all those are things. And in terms of angiosperms, the number of species, which is 14% of the global total, which is a bit old data, more than 35,000, and insects, 75,000, which is about 10% of the global data. Birds, 1,200, which is about 13% of the data. And this was also mentioned by Dr. Lila Sharma in the assessment, Himalayan assessment, that at least 352 new species have been described as a new species within 10 years. Likewise, fauna, we have diversity of fauna, like 200 species, more than 200 species, which includes Royal Bengal tiger, rhinoceros, Asiatic elephant, Gangetic dolphin, snow leopard, Himalayan brown bear, red panda, and so on, and so many, yak, Himalayan thar, and so on. In Himalaya, highest known vascular plants are Suriana falutis, which occurs at 6,400 meters, very high. Irmania himalayensis occur at 6,300 meters. Arneria bryophylla occurs at 6,180 meters. In Nepal, ecoregions, ecosystems, and forest types. So this is a book which was edited and then covers a lot of information about Nepal. And on the basis of vegetation ecology published over there, it is considered that 55 forest types occur now in Nepal, which is contribution by Miha et al. Whereas Stenton has mentioned 35 forest types. So these 55 forest types have been described on the basis of 5 important factors, 5 important elements. Altitudinal belts, very important, climatic zones, humidity types, plant life forms, and human impacts. All they contribute to forest types. But also there are ecoregions, 11 ecoregions told by Ganesan, ecosystems 118, vegetation types 75 in Nepal, 35 forest types have been identified by Stenton. The biodiversity heritage of Nepal, where species richness, this comes from 6th national report, flora, total flora 30,000 species, which is about 8% increase from 2014 report. Fauna about 17,000 more, which is about a 30% increase from 2014 report. And also some studies have been conducted at gene level, genetic diversity of taxus species, where in Nepal previously there was 1 species, taxus wallacina. Now there are 3 species of taxus. Tylotrium species, which is described by Khatiwada et al., and Microphylla species described by Kathiawar et al. Plant species richness in the flowering in the Nepal Himalaya, which is the longest altitudinal gradients by Olavetas and greatness. So species richness of flowering plants, which is based on extrapolation that it has altitudinal distribution highest at between 1,500 to 2,200 meters, and endemic species richness is highest at 4,000 meters. When we talk about Sikkim Himalaya, this is by Ofen et al. Also, the pattern is same, hump-shaped model. However, the altitudinal gradient is less in Sikkim Himalaya, which is about 1,200 to 2,000 meters. So there are plant species richness, some other groups, so that I don't want to go in detail, like bicycle plants have peaked to 1,500 to 2,500 meters in Nepal, like ferns have 1,900, mosses 2,500, and so on. So then Sikkim Himalaya, there are some very important publications, noteworthy publications, Rapid Biodiversity Survey, Flora of Sikkim, Climate Change in Sikkim, also some papers by Kandel et al. And Vegetation Environment Relationship. This is a recent paper in 2021. They have been published. But now coming to the medicinal plants, which is very, very important. And this figure is very well known, that Himalaya is rich in biodiversity and especially medicinal plants. And this is a compilation of some old data, but then it gives a flavor that how much biodiversity medicinal plants are imported. Like in India, more than 3,000 species of medicinal plant out of total 7,500, which is about 17%, and Sikkim Himalaya, more than 700, which is about 16%. Nepal, so 900 to 1,200, which is about 15 to 20% of the medicinal plants of total flora. So some important noteworthy plants like Ophiocordyceps sinensis, which has big market. Then Triphala, which is very important, made up of three important Harro, Burro, and Amla. So those are the things. Now, what are the biodiversity conservation approaches? Yes, in situ conservation is one very important thing that have been taken, which is outside and both within the protected area. Forest management in Nepal is done by government managed forest, community managed forest, collaborative forest, leasehold forest, and so on. And the total area of the forest in Nepal is 44% of the area. Land cover quantification in Nepal has increased a lot of fragmentation, forest patches, which was 16,925 in 1930, that has increased in 2014 to 42,000 patches. So this is very remarkable and threatful condition. Protected area in Nepal, now coming back here, does it cover for all species, which gives a light on why to conserve biodiversity outside protected areas? There are 20 protected areas in Nepal. And when you see the distribution of the protected areas in altitudinal gradient, the altitudinal gradient from 700, 600 up to 2,500 is less representative. So this is a bit old information published in 2010, but this shows that it covers only 40% of the flowering plants of the country, 85% of mammals, 96% of birds, 71% of herpetofauna fauna, and 32.5% of endemic plant species. It shows that we must go outside protected area for conservation. Other approaches are Ramsar sites. So Kositapu, the left one, is the oldest and the first one, and Maipokri, which is the only Ramsar site in Kanchenjunga landscape. Another approach is the forest protection areas by corridors and connectivities, and then which is about total in Nepal. Important bird areas are there. This has been, the data has been improved now to 37 numbers. Important plant areas, which is in which there are 230 important plant areas, complexes. There are botanical gardens, 11 ex-situ gene bank, in which National Gene Bank, more than 11,000 accessions have been preserved. Landscape approach, we talk about landscape approach. This is a very important approach, as Dr. Sharma has mentioned, and we have been working in that one. So this works for biodiversity and people. And this is also important that it responds triple anthropogenic challenges. One is the biodiversity loss, second climate change, and unsustainable land use. And when you see the landscape status in Nepal, there are 6 landscapes right now. And if you see the area of the country, it covers more than 85 of the country as landscape conservation, more than 85% of the landscape conservation of the country. Then transboundary landscape at landscape level, so which was mentioned. Kanchenjunga landscape, very important landscape, because this Kanchenjunga landscape and all kinds of landscape complement protected areas. And this is on the basis of an ecoregion based approach, which covers Nepal, India, and Bhutan. So this is an important landscape. Other major drivers that I am not going into detail, which was mentioned by Dr. Lila Nath Sharma in his keynote address, like past and present human activities contribute to loss of biodiversity. Habitat destruction and degradation is taking place. Direct competition for people, living space, and resources between people and wildlife species is taking place. Global climate change also threatens biodiversity and cultural diversity. So this is then global climate change, which was talked also that, well, globally, if this information says that 1 million species are at risk. So this is very alarming figure. And when there is increase of climate or temperature by 2.5 degrees centigrade, between 20 to 30% of the Earth's species could disappear. So this is very alarming situation. And indigenous people and climate change also is felt by indigenous peoples and local communities. And this is from a Tibetan villager who warns that if there's no disappears from our sacred mountains, people will disappear from the globe. So this is the thing. Key challenges, very important, which was talked in by all key persons in the first session. Livelihood, very important issue, which is very taking place. Key challenges are, for example, biodiversity loss is taking place. A lot of things have been taking place here. Biodiversity loss. Then it is taking place through deforestation, earthquake also in our country, made a lot of destruction, fire, and then those things have been also are the key challenges of the Nepal Himalaya. Then road construction, which takes place in Pansar district. So this area comes from Singhalila part in Nepal Himalaya. So unplanned road construction, which is the major habitat of red panda, this is taking place here. Then invasive alien species is another very important threat. So Micania, all other things, Eupatorium, they are taking place. They are the important invasive species. Then what are the conservation and management practices taking place here? So in the beginning, species level conservation was taking place, where flagship species and keystone species conservation took place. But now that has been moved. And now the conservation history and policy review says that the protection from 1960, from a species approach, it has moved to participatory approach in 1980s in Nepal, and we are now at the landscape level conservation. So this is what we are doing in Nepal. Conservation through traditional knowledge is very important. Traditional ecological knowledge of communities, indigenous peoples and local communities, they are very important. There are some sacred groups significantly that conserve higher diversity. There are customary institutions that are taking place in the Himalayas. To give you one example, this comes from Kailash sacred landscape, that how indigenous management system are conserving the biodiversity by local communities. So this comes from an example of pasture land, like they have local rules that people can use the grassland in rainy season, which is they call it Jarka at the high altitudes. Then slowly they move Tonka, autumn season, and then in Gunka, winter season, lower altitude grasslands. But they also use Tonka and Soika, which is a spring season at the same time. And one fails to give this rules, they are required for they are asked for a lot of penalty for that one. Role of customary institutions is very, very important. Ecosystem approach is very important because we talked about participatory forest resource management. So in Nepal, the community forest is handed over 2.27 million hectares to 22,000 users group, and that covers about 40% of the country's total area. But one thing which is a shortcoming here is that here ecosystem concerns are considered different from development aspects. So development aspect is not considered as part of ecosystem services. There is lack of interdependence of ecosystem services and human needs. They are often ignored, and diverse declining ecosystem services that are taking place social groups are not acknowledged that they really conserve biodiversity. Conservation and development linkages are very, very important. So when we say conservation, so often conservation is argued that they are in conflict with development. And sustainable development, which we talk here, that a philosophical thinker in India, Mahatma Gandhi, what he has mentioned more than a century ago, Mahatma Gandhi said that Earth provides enough resources to satisfy every man's need, but not any man's greed. Whereas Brundtland Commission in 1987, only 3.5 decades ago, defined sustainable development as our common future, development that meets the needs of present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Conservation and development linkages are very, very important. But here we talk, when we say development, this is very much a paradigm, development paradigm, but this is also a very much context specific. Context specific in a sense that it encompasses social, economic, environmental issues, such as economic growth, poverty reduction, infrastructure expansion, energy interdependence, and adaptation to climate change. So when we started working and making documents for Kanchenjunga landscape, we have put our understanding of development as initiatives and interventions that are manageable at local level based on management of ecosystems, providing goods and services which contribute to attaining healthy ecosystem, livelihoods, and human well-being on sustained manner. This is our understanding for our Kanchenjunga landscape. So biodiversity contributes to sustainable development, no doubt. But there's one thing, and there are several papers published on that one. But one thing very important to consider here is that global sustainability goals can it be achieved without improved knowledge on societal and ecological systems, that we are talking socio-ecological system, and effective governance and influence of institutions. So this is a question. Human well-being is another very important thing. Traditionally, it is measured by economic indicators and the GDP of the country, but non-economic dimension of the well-being, which is often ignored. This is the quality of life. So human well-being, which is quality of life, prosperity, and social progress and development, where societal well-beings are essential. The IPBES conceptual framework brings that nature solutions are very, very important. There are 6 elements which are linked with nature. With nature, there are linked up anthropogenic assets, nature's benefits to people. There are institutions, there are governance systems, and other indirect drivers of change. There are direct drivers of change. Good quality of life, human being, they're all interrelated. So nature-based solution is very, very important, which is also one of the important themes of this program. Now, governance on natural resources, which was talked in 1968 as a tragedy of commons, but then Garrett Hardin expressed that was a mistake, because a managed commons can bring a lot of good things to the freedom of commons. And this is called socio-ecological system, which was developed by Eleanor Ostrom and her co-researchers, still on evolving theory of common pool resources, and a set of critical resources, which has very important things, that it is regulated by a combination of both social and ecological systems. And something like ecosystem structures, like Satoyama, provide ecosystem services, they're human systems, they make actions, and also they give continuity to ecosystem services. This is called as social ecological system. When we started working in one of the mid-hills in Nepal, not far from Pokhara, we found this sort of the interlinkages. Forests provide a lot of ecosystem services. That forest provides litter and fodder, and that litter goes to cultivated fields, and fodder is eaten by livestock. But then there is also a very important linkage between cultivated lands and livestock, because livestock provide manure and cultivated fields provide fodder, and then they provide food to the household, and then that provides forest also provides fuel. So this is how households are very, very important, and social ecological perspectives is very important for household needs. Now I'm coming almost towards the end. What are the take-home messages? Link biodiversity from development and human well-being. Because when we study biodiversity, we study mostly environment, but little to do with human well-being. Number one. Second important thing is that when we undertake research, we take research on direct drivers, deforestation, land use, climate change, But the indirect drivers like demographic, economic, social, political, cultural factors, they are ignored. So this is very important to consider. My second take-home message is that need for commitment, national commitment, integrating national institutions and mainstreaming into countries' policy and planning, which is very important. But one thing is very important, that in the least developing countries, like many least developing countries, this biodiversity conservation is the agenda of less powerful government. Also, increased focus on climate change, but biodiversity conservation, ecosystem services, and soil study, we lack needed attention. Need for developing sensible biodiversity policy, which is very important. And for that one, what we need to do that, those information need to be given to the politicians in understandable language, in their understandable language. So this is very important, that how we transfer our knowledge. Take-home message, another take-home message is that awareness raising is very important, education, which is a part of biodiversity strategy. Transboundary cooperation, which is talked about across boundaries, that is very important. And this is important how we can harmonize in consistent policy around when we undertake transboundary cooperation. And there is an important lesson that, for example, there was logging ban in Thailand and China, and that have led to increased logging and forest loss in Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, Russian Far East, and Mongolia. So this is important, that we need a harmonization of the policy. Banning one activity in one country does not work. So this is an example how this from the Kailash sacred landscape, those logging are going towards transboundary landscape. So my conclusions come here, that Himalayas is disproportionately rich in biodiversity. It represents a real cultural landscape, man-made ecosystems for many thousands of years. Number one, there are many potential threats to biodiversity, including indirect drivers that we need to study. Biodiversity is of real and potential value because they are potential value of ecologically, economically, aesthetically, culturally, and so on. Very important thing is to promote indigenous local knowledge and use. And for that one, dissemination of information and collaborative research is very, very important. We need to enhance community development, and community's participation is very important here. Integrated holistic approach that was also talked in keynote speech, combining concerned institutions, other social sciences, natural sciences, multi-stakeholders, that are very, very important. Then equitable sharing of benefits over natural resources. For that, we should ensure inclusiveness of the people. Transboundary landscape through regional cooperation is very important. That was talked also previously. Linking biodiversity, ecosystem services, and human well-being. That is very important. And strengthen relationship between people and nature, where we need to change, to think about transformative changes. How can we meet sustainable development goals and post-2020 agendas? Globally, CBD alone is not sufficient. Bring biodiversity, climate change, and socio-ecological issues together, and where we have to come up with some paradigm shift. So with this, look biodiversity and conservation from the well-being and human well-being from the eyes of future generations. Thank you. I would like to thank Tribhuvan University, Sikkim University, ATREE, G.B. Pant Institute, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Lila Nath Sharma, Sarla Kaling, Sunita Pradhan, Bhoj Kumar, Hemant Batola, and so on. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Chaudhury. I think it was a very comprehensive presentation, very well elaborated examples, and then I think your experience of 43 years was vividly reflected on your presentation. I request you and all the speakers to remain until the end, because I'm also requesting all the participants to reserve their queries, so that towards the end we will have some time for taking up the questions. So Professor Chaudhury, now please be here until this whole session is over. So thank you very much, Professor Chaudhury, once again. Now I think we move to the next presentation, which is a invited talk, and which will be given by Dr. R. Ganesan, who is the Senior Fellow at Suri Sehgal Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at ATREE, Bangalore, Karnataka. And Dr. Ganesan is a botanist who has explored plant diversity and plant bioresources of South and Northeast India. He's a fellow at ATREE, Bangalore. He has a PhD in botany from the University of Madras, Chennai. He is a member of the Indian Association of Angiosperm Taxonomy, IAAT, India, and Systematic Association, UK, International Society for Tropical Ecology. This is a very important, very old ecological society in India. Then Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation, USA, and the International Society for Tropical Foresters, USA. His main research interests are in plant taxonomy and systematics of the Lauraceae family in India and cataloging plant diversity, sustainable use of bioresources, and improving livelihoods, long-term monitoring of biodiversity changes through vegetation monitoring plots in the Western Ghats. I'm very happy there is somebody who has a Western Ghat experience also here. Improving and managing the green cover of urban landscapes. He is also keen to disseminate knowledge about diversity and functional aspects of biodiversity among the public and policymakers to influence biodiversity conservation. It's really wonderful to have you, Dr. Ganesan, in this session. I'm very pleased, and I really look forward, and all the participants are looking forward to hear from you. You have 20 minutes from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. It was, thank you, Dr. Chaudhury, and thank you, Dr. Kare, University Vice Chancellor, Sikkim University Vice Chancellor, and Dr. Sharla Kaling for providing me this wonderful opportunity to talk to you all. Though I have visited and I do research in Himalayan region, especially Northeastern region, and I have heard and read a lot about Professor Sharma's work and Professor Chaudhury's work, but it's the first time I'm seeing, of course, through the video screen. So it's a really wonderful opportunity. Thank you all of you to share my research experience, especially off-reserve management of biological resources in the Northeastern region. And here in the outset itself, I would like to say that while I'm doing the research as well as referring to the literature, I could see a thin line between crop wild relatives and wild biological resources. That is largely biological resources, bioresources that are edible and consumed by the local community in the region. And my job is made very easy by Professor Sharma and Professor Chaudhury by showing the panorama of entire Himalayan biodiversity and the conservation issues and the efforts that has been made to protect our precious biodiversity for all of us. So generally, the protected areas are established and with the main reason that to conserve the biodiversity and improve the habitats of this precious biodiversity and biological resources of the region. And there is an effort to increase the protected areas to the 17% by 2020 target. I don't know what is the present figure of protected areas across the globe. Of course, definitely the percentage would have gone up because of concerted effort from all the countries globally. But there are lots of questions. Do protected areas really taking care of biodiversity conservation holistically? That's always being challenged, and it is an effort that kept challenged by various developmental activities, especially due to the burgeoning human population and the land use changes. So in that way, feel that the existing protected areas cannot effectively conserve the biodiversity for a long term, and there are lots of issues related with biodiversity conservation outside the protected areas, because protected areas are having more of legalized access to the biological resources. And as Professor Chaudhury earlier mentioned, and Professor Sharma also mentioned earlier, that we cannot remove not even a single leaf from the protected area. That basically affects the people dependency on these biological resources and the traditional way of living on the forest-based biological resources. So please go to the next slide. So the protected areas are not really functionally acting as a biodiversity reservoirs, in the sense there are lots of things are happening inside the protected areas in such a way that many of the populations of the biological resources may go unnoticed. So I would like to bring in a kind of new approach. Of course, there are globally there are many such proposals, and as Professor Sharma has exactly mentioned, that it's a new paradigm in conserving biodiversity, especially in the human-dominated landscapes such as the Himalayan region. So I thought I should identify, because everyone, we generally, when we talk about protected area management and the biodiversity which is lying outside the protected areas, or the population of those species which are already protected in the protected areas are being threatened because of continuous developmental oriented landscape changes. So that way, I thought, why don't we use crop wild relatives and other wild edible plants which are collected from the landscape that is dominated by the human resource as a kind of charismatic species, or by championing these crop wild relatives, we will be able to conserve the biodiversity that is lying outside the protected area. And the second important issue is that how we can link the biodiversity which is lying outside, and how we can link the two segregated or two fragmented protected areas by using these cultivated wild relatives of crop plants. Generally, crop wild relatives are nothing but wild plant species that are genetically related to cultivated crops. And because they are in the wild condition and they are not cultivated, and they are in constant interaction with the environment, they keep on evolving with new traits, and especially the traits that we can exploit, or we are exploiting it for our human welfare, is that like drought tolerance or salt tolerance, pest resistance, and various other good quality that is very, very important to make a wild species as more of edible species. So, and in the process, farmers and breeders are the ultimate beneficiaries of this kind of crop wild relatives. So my talk at the end would be summarizing how we can use crop wild relatives and wild biological resources, or the edible plants which are distributed away from the protected areas, can be used or champion them as a charismatic species to conserve the biodiversity lying outside the protected areas. Next slide, please. So generally, these CWRs, that is crop wild relatives and wild edible plants, are found in more human-dominated landscapes. As I mentioned here, many of them are found along the roadsides, field margins, fallow fields, irrigation canals and reservoirs, and plantations. And these cultivated wild relatives are also giving an opportunity for us to practice in such a way that we human can really manipulate this population or the products in such a way that we'll be able to freely access the resources for the human welfare, especially improving the livelihoods of the marginalized community. And also, the conservation of cultivated or crop wild relatives should facilitate more of a multi-stakeholders partnership in such a way that the livelihoods of the people who are dependent of these wild biological resources can be improved. And at present, the wild biological resources, or the cultivated or the crop wild relatives which are inside the protected areas, cannot be really manipulated in such a way that we can bring in restoration and regeneration activities. So that's a reason, that's a main reason I feel that we should champion the idea of protecting the biological resources and crop wild relatives which are lying outside the protected areas. Next slide, please. And in the when we see the cultivated wild, crop wild relatives or wild edible plants, they are a kind of, I feel that they are more a kind of orphan, because crop plants are taken care by agriculture departments, whereas wild animals and plants are taken care by Forest Wildlife Act or the protected area management. Whereas these kind of crop wild relatives and wild edible plants are, as I said earlier, more of orphan, and they are falling the crack between the protected area regulations as well as the effort that is taken care by agriculture practices. So it is somewhere we have to find a way to bring in these crop wild relatives and wild edible plants to the center stage in such a way that they are also treated on par with the biodiversity that is being protected inside the protected area. So next slide, please. So generally we say crop wild relatives, and especially from the breeders' point of view and plant genetic resources point of view, they are very, very important. But again, when the biodiversity conservation comes, the wild plants and wild animals comes to the center stage, whereas the crop wild relatives go to the back door, and their habitats are also taken over by, or overwhelmingly destroyed by developmental activities. So, for example, here this IPBS report brings crop wild relatives to the center stage by saying that they are they are going to be the savior for the food security, and also these crop wild relatives are more resilient to stresses like climate change and pests and pathogens. And also generally crop wild relatives, because as I mentioned earlier, they are found along the roadsides and many other underutilized or unutilized spaces. They are called as worthless weeds. But if you look at the value, it's in several billions across the world. Next slide, please. So Himalayas, especially, not only very, very diverse with the ethnic communities and the associated biodiversity and the knowledge associated with it. So there are lots and lots of crop wild relatives. Take any plant, from my botanical understanding, one day or another day, every plant species will become a kind of crop wild relatives. That is what I feel. But traditionally, our indigenous community in these landscapes have domesticated many of the wild plants, and then you can see that ranges from cereals to pseudo cereals to highly commercially valuable fruits. Next slide, please. And there are lots and lots of temperate plant species which are very much important for the food security, especially the crop wild relatives of wheats and rice, which are found in the remote snow-clad mountains of Western Himalayas. And if we, next slide, please. And if we move to Eastern Himalayas, the tropical forests, especially the rainforests, drenched with rain, they are having tons and tons of wild edible plants. And the way the list of publications have come, the list of biological resources I have seen in the markets, and especially the indigenous people market, any plant any day or any season really can sustain the human lives for millions and millions of years in the Himalayan mountains. So the list of wild plants are really awesome, and then quite diverse. Especially if you take Sikkim Himalayas, the agrobiodiversity includes about 70 crop species and 178 cultivated varieties. And the researchers are like Dr. Chaudhury mentioned earlier, like the Nepal Himalayas or Bhutan Himalayas, the Sikkim Himalayan part are so diverse and so endowed with plant resources, which are very, very important for the future, especially in the scenario of climate change. Next slide, please. So through the research project supported by Department of Biotechnology, we documented quite many biological resources and then try to understand the economic value of these biological resources at the household level as at the market level. It was very, very mind-boggling figure that millions and millions of Indian rupees are as part of the commerce rooted in the crop wild relatives and wild biological resources or wild edible plants that has been extensively harvested and utilized in the northeastern region. Next slide, please. So my question was like large mammals or any mammal species or any conservation areas that are designated as protected areas. So why should we have additional protected areas to conserve more of biodiversity? So my question was put in a kind of exclamatory way that I try to understand do the crop wild relatives are really getting protected inside the protected areas. Yes, they are getting protected within the protected areas, but the protection status is more of passive. That means that like any other large mammal, we try to protect the habitat, but the other species may go unnoticed, and then their protection, their population status may be go unnoticed. And because the larger concentration for the habitat improvement more towards the large mammal or the kind of umbrella species based on which the protected areas are established. So in the process, we may lose the CWR, that is crop wild relatives, within the protected area because there is no active conservation efforts have been made by putting the crop wild relatives to the center stage. So that way, I find that there should be a way to protect the crop wild relatives outside the protected areas. Next slide, please. So the protected areas are for the species-specific conservation. So they may not really support over a long term to conserve the crop wild relatives. So the better alternative should be off-reserve management. That is how to manage those areas which are not under the protected area regime, but still they are as good as or on par with the protected areas biodiversity point of view. Because not only the large mammals or the biodiversity should be in the center stage, because there are human dominated landscape, they also have lots of biodiversity and they should also come to the center stage of conservation, but with a different regime of management. So basically this off-reserve management principle should be for the areas that are having lots of crop wild relatives and edible wild plants. So these reserves, off-reserve, should have a kind of principle or policy that takes care of long-term management, and that also have a kind of specific management, that is active management principle, in such a way that facilitates protection of the or taking care of the population genetics of these cultivated crop wild relatives.
Dr. Ganesan, you have a few minutes left, okay?
Yeah, sorry, I will move in another 2 minutes, sorry. So and also this off-reserve management provides ample of opportunity or window of opportunity for community to be part of it. Next slide, please. So I made a kind of scheme in such a way that how biodiversity conservation in the off-reserve can be kind of resulting in conserving the crop wild relatives. So once we prioritize the crop wild relatives, and we should bring in kind of policy. At present, I don't think that there are any policy that takes care of protecting the crop wild relatives outside the protected areas. So we should tinker and tune in developing that kind of policy that take care of crop wild relatives which are lying outside the protected areas. The second thing is that we also have to bring in the community active participation in conserving this crop wild relatives outside the protected areas. For that, we have to bring in a kind of new set of policies in such a way that there is active interaction between the conservation agencies and the local community for the safeguard of protecting or conserving these crop wild relatives. So ultimately, the end result by the practice with the policy developments, we will be able to conserve crop wild relatives and their habitats, as well as this also will give a kind of a much better hold for the local community in maintaining those biological resources in the kind of off-reserve management practice. And also these fragments of or the fragments of seed crop wild relative conservation reserves can be linked to the larger protected area. So I envisage a kind of larger landscape level conservation effort that unites the mammal centric protected areas plus this crop wild resource or wild edible plant centric micro conservation reserves in such a way that the whole landscape level conservation is more effective. So I stop here. Thank you very much for the kind of wonderful opportunity, and I'm very much humbled to be part of the August audience to share my.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ganesan. I think the topic is so important. If we are going to look at the future food security and crop diversity and the so much of enormous wealth lies in wild relatives. So the approach which you have outlined is very, very important. And I think that's going to contribute a lot. So we will have a question and answer section a little later on. But meanwhile, I would like to request you to wait, and then let me introduce the next speaker, Dr. T.R. Shankaraman, who is scientist, Nature Conservation Foundation, Mysore, Karnataka, India. He is a writer and wildlife scientist with the Nature Conservation Foundation. He is interested in the ecology and conservation of tropical forests and wildlife, especially in Western Ghats, very important biodiversity region. He is based at the Field Research Station in Valparaiso in Anamalai Hills. He is the author of The Wild Heart of India, Nature and Conservation in the City, the Country, and the Wild, and co-author with Divya Mudappa of The Pillars of Life, Magnificent Trees of the Western Ghats. He blogs of View from Elephant Hills, and he has given also the link. So we are really looking forward, Dr. Shankaraman, and now you will have 20 minutes presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can see my screen and hear me clearly.
Yes, sir. Your screen is visible and you're audible.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Sharma. And I'm very happy to be here to talk to all of you about biodiversity beyond protected areas. I think the eminent speakers before me, Professor Sharma, Professor Chaudhury, and Dr. Ganesan have highlighted how the biodiversity, whether it is wild species or wild relatives of cultivated species, are very important to conserve, and the conservation cannot happen only inside protected reserves. We also have to look at landscapes outside, and I think this is an idea that has really caught on worldwide, and it has also spawned a lot of fields of research. for instance, in sustainable agricultural practices, in what is called countryside biogeography, and also in this debate about whether we to achieve our conservation goals, whether we should have land sparing, which is setting aside land for conservation, or land sharing, where we are sharing land and our landscapes with other forms of life. So these are sort of global concepts and research that is going on today. And my presentation today is going to talk about some of this from the perspective of studies carried out on birds, bird communities in different parts of India, in two main regions in India. One is in the Anamalai Hills of the Western Ghats, where I live and work, and also some prior research that I have done in Mizoram, which is a hill state in northeastern India. And before I begin, I'd like to thank a lot of people who you can see on these slides. I have carried out this research over the last 20 odd years with a number of them, and without them, I couldn't have carried out this work. So I'd like to register my thanks and acknowledgements to all of them. So the two areas that I'm going to be talking to you about are the Anamalai landscape, which is in the Tamil Nadu part of the Western Ghats. And as you can see from this photograph, this is a landscape which is sort of a mid-elevation landscape. It's at about 700 to about 1400 meters elevation. It's a sort of a rolling plateau, which used to be covered with tropical wet evergreen forests or rainforest about 120 years ago. But today, since the British times and the colonial period, a lot of these areas, nearly 200 square kilometers of this, was converted to plantations. And so what you have today is a landscape that looks like this. You have patches of forest, rainforest, which we call rainforest fragments, and we have different landscape elements around them. You have degraded patches, you have eucalyptus plantations, tea plantations, coffee plantations, human settlements, roads, different kinds of anthropogenic or man-modified habitats around here. So in the Anamalai landscape, one of our major questions has been to ask, how does the fragmentation of forest affect the conservation of birds and other groups? And it's not just by looking at the rainforest fragments themselves, but also by looking at what's around these fragments in the different kinds of plantations to understand the overall effects. At the other end of India, in Northeast India, my work has been in the Dampa landscape in Mizoram. Now, Dampa is a tiger reserve in the western part of Mizoram, adjoining Bangladesh. And this area also is covered with tropical forests. And the primary form of land use there has been shifting agriculture or jhum cultivation. Now, as probably most of you are familiar with this, jhum cultivation creates a mosaic of habitats, areas which are cleared for cultivation, and then after cultivation, the land is rested for a few years, so the forests recover, and then there are patches of more mature forests also in the landscape. So the jhum landscape mosaic is very typical of the hill tracts all along the eastern Himalaya and the hill states of Northeast India. But in addition to the jhum landscape itself, there is also modification of that in recent times through things such as oil palm plantations, which is a monoculture crop, or through forestry and timber plantations such as teak, as illustrated here. So in these two landscapes, my primary questions have been as listed here. So in the Anamalai Hills, it's questions related to fragmentation, as I mentioned, and also as to how do rainforest birds respond when the forests are altered to plantations like tea and coffee. Whereas in the Dampa landscape, the question has been as to how do bird communities recover after shifting cultivation as the forest recovers, post-cultivation. And also, since there are different kinds of land use, including the monoculture plantations, the question arises, is jhum a better form of land use than these monocultures? So I will first talk about the Anamalai Hills, but in both landscapes, my work has used bird surveys and surveys of habitat. So the bird surveys in the Anamalai Hills has largely been point count surveys of 5-minute duration, So there's a large number, more than 2,000 point counts over the years that has been carried out. Whereas in Dampa, we have used line transect surveys to look at the recovery of forest after shifting cultivation, as well as the effects of different land uses. All this data has been uploaded to eBird as well as Data Dryad, and it's publicly available. So besides the bird data, we have also gone and tried to measure the habitat through quadrats, PCQ plots, and other kinds of measurements. I won't go into this in detail right now, but I'm just putting it out there to say that we have looked at bird community change in relation to how the habitat is changing. So coming to the Anamalais, so this map shows you, the main protected area here is the Anamalai Tiger Reserve, which occupies nearly 1,000 square kilometers. And to the west and south of it are other protected areas in the state of Kerala. And right in the middle of that is the Valparai Plateau, which is a 200 square kilometer area. And you can see all these dark green patches are the tropical wet evergreen forests or rainforest fragments that are distributed. Some are inside the protected area and some are in the plantation landscape. So when we went in and looked at the birds in these forest fragments, one thing that was immediately evident is that actually you have more species of birds in the landscape than in just the protected area. And but the increased species richness of birds in the fragmented landscape is because that there are many birds of open country, birds that are not typically found in rainforests, but are found in drier and more open habitats that kind of infiltrate into this landscape. And this graph here kind of shows you how these birds are distributed and which ones are distributed in relation to the area of the fragment. And this is an indicator species analysis. And what I would like to sort of emphasize here is that you can see that most species are responding to area, but at a very small thresholds. So as the area of the fragments increases, you find the open country birds begin to decline in abundance and more or less disappear in the large sites, whereas the rainforest birds sort of increase in abundance and are found more in the larger fragments. But the thresholds are quite small, even the range of 20 to 30 hectares. A patch of 20 to 30 hectares is already having a significant component of the rainforest bird community and has much fewer open country species. And this is what we also found when we looked at community parameters. How's the total number of bird species? How does it change with area? If you look at the graph, you see that most of the change actually happens in very small area thresholds. So beyond that area threshold, actually there is not much change in species across area. On the graph on the right side top, you can see that the richness, we repeated these surveys after 19 years, and we find that actually the richness has not changed much in the landscape overall. But more recent analysis suggests that after you account for the effects of habitat, there's been a slight decline in species richness of birds over time in this landscape. When it comes to the abundance of birds, we find that there is a strong decline in abundance, particularly of rainforest birds. And we still do not know why this is. So the protected area has been protected right through, and most of the forest fragments in the landscape have stayed stable in terms of their size, but still we find that birds are declining by about 20 to 30% across this 20-year period. And this trend that we found in our study of how rainforest birds and particularly endemic birds are decreasing in the landscape over time sort of mirrors this finding from a much larger landscape scale study, which was brought out in the State of India's Birds Report in 2020, where Western Ghats endemic birds are showing substantial declines over a 20-odd year period, and we are seeing that in the Anamalais as well. And the causes for this are still unknown as of now. But one thing that does come out from our research is that the quality of the habitat matters a lot to the birds. So on the left, you can see these secondary habitats, which are far more open. Half the trees are gone. There are a lot more pioneer species and weeds. And on the right, you see a more intact habitat. So the better the quality, the more rainforest birds can be sustained in these sites. So the key findings from this part of the work suggests that at the landscape level, fragmentation may actually increase species richness, but this is due to the infiltration of open country birds. And the decrease in patch size affects rainforest birds, but with fairly low area threshold. So even small patches of forest can actually help conserve birds, particularly if their habitat quality is good. And the declines in abundance of rainforest birds is a matter of concern, which we have to look at, as to why this is happening. As I mentioned, we did not look at birds only in the fragments. We also looked at the tea and coffee plantations outside. So you have here you see an example of what the tea plantations typically look like in the Western Ghats. In the photo on the left, it's a monoculture crop with just a single tree species, the silver oak, which is an Australian tree species, as shade tree. Very rarely do you see tea plantations like on the right, where native shade trees are used. So we carried out surveys looking at conventional tea, organic tea, shade grown, or tea which had some native shade trees, and also contrasted that with rainforest fragments and continuous forests to get a sense of what are the birds doing in the landscape surrounding these protected areas and the rainforest fragments. And interestingly, we found that although the tea plantations, particularly conventional tea plantations, had fewer birds as compared to the forests, the tea plantations that had some native shade trees actually had substantial abundance of birds. But again, this is a mix of both open country species and rainforest species. Like the red-whiskered bulbul is an open country species on the left, and you can see the Malabar trogon, which is a rainforest species, on the right. What happens if you look only at rainforest birds? When we looked only at rainforest birds, a clearer pattern emerges. Clearly, the rainforest fragments and the continuous forests are most important for rainforest birds. But what's interesting is that conventional tea, the monoculture, is actually much poorer for rainforest birds, and converting the conventional tea plantation to organic makes only a slight difference. Whereas the big difference arises when, instead of just silver oak shade trees, a variety of native shade trees are used. That helps to support much more biodiversity in the surrounding landscape. And this is sort of the finding as far as the tea plantations go. There's only small gains in going organic, but much larger gains if native shade trees are used. And that's to be expected because, after all, most of the birds in this landscape are rainforest birds. Besides tea, we also looked at coffee plantations. And I won't go into this in great detail, but coffee, because it's a shade-grown crop, is grown under different kinds of shade, from light shade to heavy shade, and sort of one or two species as shade trees to much more diverse canopy. And what we found was very similar to what we found in tea, is that the more native shade trees that you have in the canopy, like in the photograph on the left, the more diversity of native birds can you support in the surrounding landscape. And we also found another interesting pattern when we looked at birds and rainforest fragments that adjoined coffee plantations and rainforest fragments that were surrounded by tea plantations or reservoirs, like the two photos that you see here. So in one case, the landscape connectivity is high because just outside is a crop which has a lot of tree cover, versus if it was a tea plantation or reservoir, you have much lower landscape connectivity because of poorer tree cover. And what we found is that not only does this benefit the rainforest fragments to have plantations such as coffee adjoining it rather than tea, we found that coffee plantations also have more birds if they have rainforest fragments nearby. So the connectivity with surrounding habitats is a key aspect to consider. So these results suggest that habitat structure, particularly the occurrence of woody trees, makes a lot of difference to the bird community in plantations, and their connectivity and what surrounds these plantations is also very important. But even the best coffee estates lack many species of rainforest birds. So it's not like these surrounding habitats can be a replacement for rainforest or protected mature forests, but they can supplement the conservation in these cases. So the Anamalai work, in conclusion, kind of says that we need to conserve patches that are both small as well as the large tracts. But there is a lot of potential to enhance the surrounding human use landscape, particularly by including native shade tree species, which can help in conservation. We've also found that restoring these fragments, basically increasing the habitat quality, can help in recovering birds. That's an aspect that I've not spoken about here, but we have some evidence that that also partially helps and can be considered for surrounding landscapes. So, but there is mature and primary forests are irreplaceable, and we cannot afford to lose them as well. So very briefly, I will also talk to you about some learnings from
your time is almost gone.
Okay, I'm very sorry. Just a couple of slides here.
Summarize, yeah. Please.
Yes. So in the Mizoram landscape, I looked at a range of successional stages from open fallow to mature forest. And what we found there was similar in the sense that there was very rapid recovery of bird communities over time. So even very young stages of forest can actually support a lot of birds. And I'll just jump a couple of figures here and to say that when we compared the June landscape, where the forest is actually recovering after cultivation, with other plantations such as oil palm and teak, we find that actually oil palm plantations and teak plantations, which are more monocultures, have far fewer species than June cultivation, which after all sustains a mosaic of habitats. So overall, these things suggest that habitats such as June or even agroforestry that incorporates a diversity of species can actually help sustain biodiversity in the surrounding landscapes much better than monoculture plantations. So I'll stop with that and end with a note of thanks to Sikkim University, ATREE, Boj, and Dr. Sarla Khali. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shankaraman. It reminded me of one of my students' work on the forest habitat and the impact of trekking corridor from Yoksung to Jongri, Nakul Chetri. So just reminded of that work, and I think it's a wonderful work. I'm very, very happy to see how fragmentation, the connectivity, and if there is in the commercial, I talked about the commercial cropping like coffee, tea, in that if we are able to bring shade trees and how it can impact the bird diversity. I think that's very, very interesting, and very interesting to see that the forest bird species, the outside bird species, and if you create a semi-situation, then the number goes up, and very nice, I think, wonderful. So let's get the questions later on. So thank you very much for
Thank you so much.
A very good presentation. And now we come to the final presentation, and I would like to invite Dr. Lila Nath Sharma, who is a researcher, forest action in Nepal, and Dr. Sharma is a trained ecologist and works as a researcher in Forest Action Nepal. He got PhD in vegetation ecology from University of Bergen, Norway. Very good. So I had been to that university some time ago, long time ago. In his PhD, Mr. Sharma assessed the impact of changes in human disturbance management in biodiversity in forest, pastures, and agroforest of central Nepal. Mr. Sharma has over 10 years of experience in research, design, project implementation, data analysis, and vegetation survey. He has been carrying out action research on various aspects of biodiversity conservation and natural resource management in forests, wetlands, high altitude pastures, and agroecosystems. Dr. Sharma's research focuses on how to harmonize social, economic, and ecological concerns in natural resource management in anthropogenic landscapes. Currently, Mr. Sharma is leading on an action research project to restore degraded forest patches in the eastern lowland of Nepal. He has published over a dozen research articles on biodiversity conservation and forest management in international peer-reviewed journals, and has co-authored 2 books. So now the floor is yours, and you have 20 minutes, Dr. Sharma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eklabesha. Namaste and good afternoon. I would like to thank Dr. Bhuj and Dr. Sarala for providing me this opportunity. In today's presentation, I will present outcome of our action research going on Eastern Nepal. Before that, I would like to say that my presentation is very much aligned with the presentation of Dr. Anamalai Sharma and my guru, Professor Ram Chaudhury, and earlier 2 presenters. So in the beginning, I will highlight a brief overview of biodiversity conservation approaches and its strength and shortcoming. Then I will briefly say about what is the opportunity of protecting biodiversity outside protected areas. And then I will jump to Jalthal forest, where we are currently working. And I will not advertise our work, but I will talk about the issues of forest management there. And at the end, I will share some of the lessons for broader biodiversity conservation from the case study. So protected area approach is the dominant strategy for biodiversity conservation. Protected area cover and number is increasing globally, but biodiversity is still threatened and we are not getting what we were supposed to get. And last year's report from IPBES says that around 1 million species are facing the risks of extinction, although the report is controversial regarding how they got the number 1 million figure. So protected areas are increasing, but still we are arguing for more protected areas. And for example, late E.O. Wilson's initiative, Half Earth initiative, that says we need half of the earth to be protected. And what is the tragedy is there? Protected area themselves are under threat from different drivers. So recent paper says that 1/3 of the global protected areas are facing pressure from anthropogenic disturbances, and now very small fraction of the land is remaining wild. So while protected areas are doing some good, and there are some limitations as well. So what are the limitations? So protected areas are not covering all the species and ecosystem. There are many species and ecosystem outside the political and administrative jurisdiction of protected areas network. And protected areas are facing challenges to meet the traditional users' subsistence needs. So there is a conflict between protected area and local people, especially in the global south. And another criticism of protected area is that they are very much narrow focused. Now they are changing gradually, but originally protected areas were focusing only on few charismatic species and wilderness areas. And now we have very little wilderness area in the earth. And so another criticism is that they did not acknowledge the traditional dependent communities. So while there are limitations and some shortcomings of protected areas, recent research have shown that there are tremendous opportunities of biodiversity conservation outside protected areas. So many threatened and endangered species of flora and fauna are occurring outside protected area. And agroforest and sacred groves have provided habitat, alternative habitat, stepping stones, and refuge to various species of plants and animals during the process of deforestation. And when it comes to species richness, there are many species in anthropogenic landscapes and or the semi-natural habitats like low intensity farms, community forest, and community conserved areas. So there are many evidences which show these areas have high species richness. And when we conserve biodiversity outside protected area, they complement protected areas indeed, and they also help in sustaining ecosystem services to the dependent population. While there are opportunities, there are some challenges in agricultural landscape or outside protected areas, though farming intensity is increasing and farming is getting more and more chemical input. And these are harming biodiversity in the anthropogenic landscape. And another problem with conservation outside protected areas is these are insufficient to conserve the species which require large undisturbed forest or undisturbed landscape.
Dr. Sharma,
Yes.
sorry for interrupting you, but your presentation is not visible and it's not moving.
Oh, sorry. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Now
Okay.
it's, yes.
It's visible?
And please, if you can do slideshow mode.
Yeah, it should be. Isn't it now?
It's not in slideshow mode.
Okay.
That's okay, but now it's visible. But it
Okay.
was not moving.
And
Okay.
we have to go a bit faster because time
Yes.
is also not much.
Thank you.
Okay. So now when we are talking about conserving biodiversity outside protected area, it's not only in the forest. It's there are campaign and movement and argument for conserving biodiversity everywhere. So they say that we will not lose while conserving biodiversity in different places. For example, cities, managed forest and gardens and everywhere. So now, if we see how forest management is changing over time, when forest management initiated some 300 years ago, it was only about timber production or sustainable timber supply and production, but now it is moving towards broader biodiversity conservation, and now it is towards climate change adaptation and earth stewardship. So biodiversity conservation outside protected area is gaining wider recognition, or there is a need has been felt. So now let's go to Jalthal forest where we are working. So Jalthal forest is located in the eastern lowland of Nepal, near Indo-Nepal border. So in the map, you can see the patch of forest in the bottom right corner, that is the Jalthal forest, and the forest is 6,300, is around 600 hectare remnant forest, and it is surrounded by agricultural field and human settlement. It is natural forest, and the forest is known for high richness and unique assemblage compared to other parts of Nepal. It's not globally unique, but for Nepal. So the forest has largest stand of Latahar tree, Atrocarpus chama, and the population of vulnerable species, Cycas pectinata. The forest is habitat of many threatened fauna like Asian elephant, Chinese pangolin, and elongated turtle. And the forest is also livelihood source of over 80,000 people. And the forest is currently being managed by 22 community forest user groups. And so recently we conducted a participatory survey of forest biodiversity, and we are about to complete this research, and we have prepared this infographics as awareness material. So there are different groups of plants and animals, and this shows that the forest is really rich in terms of floral and faunal biodiversity, and the tree flora are especially noteworthy in the forest. So this is a habitat of Asiatic elephant. And I would like to highlight some of the significant floral component of the forest. So this forest could be the richest site in Nepal in terms of tree richness. So recent research have found that 7 tree species, 3 hops, and 1 snake species to be new to Nepal. It's not new to science, but new to Nepal. And 1 tree species which we recently spotted there, Prunus silenica. It is the only endangered tree species from the lowland of Nepal. It occurs only in Jalthal, not in other parts, including protected areas. So the forest has the largest population of Cycas pectinata in Nepal. And the forest is also westbound of or the westbound resort of Ertocarpus sama in terms of it, so that it has unique assemblies of vegetation. So manifestation of twofold paradoxes. So what are the paradoxes there? The forest, we are saying the forest is rich, but at the same time, forest is equally degraded, and the forest is threatened by multiple drivers. So it is a paradox of diversity and degradation. And the major factors degrading the forest or the challenges for biodiversity are invasive species. In the upper figure, you can see the forest is heavily covered by Mycania and Chromalena, and recently a new species, Mimosa diplotrica, is coming there. And the forest management is focused on high value timber species, single species, that is sal, and the forest is becoming homogeneous. Recently, in some area, the forest is regenerating, but it is a monoculture-like stance. So the forest has sustained a very high pressure of firewood and fodder, as many people live around the forest, and there are still some hunting and illegal felling. And to recover the forest, people have planted trees, but it contains many exotic species, including eucalyptus and teak. So another paradox I want to show that, so in the forest is that forest is protected in one way, it is unprotected in other ways. So in general, the forest area is more or less intact. There is no increasement. There is increasement in forest cover. Their tree densities are increasing. Fire has been controlled to some extent, and grazing has been completely banned, and hunting and illegal felling are decreasing. So in this way, forest is being protected. But if we go deeper into the forest and look into its specific component, then the forest is not protected. So this is another paradox of Jalthal forest management. So for example, rare and threatened trees are there, they are not protected. Critically endangered animal like pangolin is there, Chinese pangolin, which is not getting adequate protection in the forest. And forest is not recovering in right direction because there are many exotic plantation. The forest has tremendous natural regeneration potential that has not been well appreciated by the management. So there are many inferior species, and lianas are removed while managing the forest. People think they are hookat or inferior species, and that has negatively impacted biodiversity of the forest. So how you look, if you look from outside, it's okay. But if you go deep into the forest, then there are some problems. So how this figure also shows the paradoxes. So in the near the settlement, the forest is degraded, species are few, and in the forest interior, the species richness increases. This is the case of the tree richness only. It's not overall richness. And another area we can see the forest tree richness has been maintained only in certain part of the forest, especially in the moist areas and the small slopes. Although it is in Tarai, the forest has some small hillocks. So if there is slope, trees are maintained or protected. Otherwise, tree diversity is very low around the near the settlement. So this is another paradox of Jalthal forest. So there are some, we can learn something from the forest. So increased
Sharma, you have only few minutes left.
Okay, so I'm trying to summing up, sir. So increased forest cover and tree density does not equate to biodiversity. So whether biodiversity is protected or not, we have to see deep into the forest. So while celebrating success of community forestry program, we must be broader in defining forest. Now forest has been defined only as trees and canopy cover. And now we have to move from forest protection to biodiversity conservation in community forest. And see, community forest, I'm not saying that, okay, we need to go to new management or it should be, it can be protected as protected areas or national park. I'm not saying that. So we have to strengthen the community forest, which are the key institution for local biodiversity conservation. So in general, Nepal's community forests are doing good job in restoring degraded hills, but they are often questioned for considering less to biodiversity. This confirms in Jalthal as well. So challenges of biodiversity conservation in Jalthal. So proper stock taking of biodiversity is beyond local capacity, and current management is not informed by the data, scientific data, and local do not have adequate capacity to tackle the new challenges. For example, biological invasion. They are removing every year Mycenia, but they are not getting the result. So they need new management tools and science. And there is political favor for the development activities when there is conflict between environment and development. So we have national orientation towards timber protection and for active forest management, which may threaten Jalthal biodiversity further. So how can we meet the challenges or address? The forest has significant biodiversity and we need management intervention to protect that. So we propose for strengthening community forestry, providing them capacity building training and providing some financial support to conserve biodiversity, and we can develop some feasible enterprises. Many enterprises have been tried in the past, but they are not working because they are not sustainable. And we can manage forest by customizing management plan depending on the local socio-ecological contingencies. Now, here are my conclusion. So there is worth conserving biodiversity outside protected areas. An uptake of community forest and protection of forest does not necessarily warrant conservation of biodiversity. How we manage biodiversity outside protected area, that determines the outcome of protected area. Conserving biodiversity in CF not only fills the gap of protected area, but also complements them towards broader biodiversity goal. So now biodiversity conservation should adapt multiple approaches, including protected area and other approaches. So it should appreciate multiple values and multifunctionality of forest and other ecosystem. I finished my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma. I think it was very interesting to see that you mentioned about protected areas and how narrow conservation measures are taking place, but there are other opportunities very much looking into the low intensity farms, then community forestry or community conservation areas. I think this is quite interesting and very good. I think people have got a very good sense of what is happening in Nepal and elsewhere, where other means of multiple approach other than protected areas can be used for conservation. So now I also request you to be there. And now I am looking at the organizers. How are we going to get the questions? Should I ask them to raise hands? If that is the case, we have 10 minutes and I will ask people to raise their hands and then ask the question succinctly, very sharp questions to the person to whom the question is addressed to should be also mentioned. So now please raise your hand and based on that we can. Or how are we going to do that, Dr. Sarala Khalin?
Dr. Sharma, raising is okay, but I think typing in would be good.
So that is also fine, but somebody has to help me.
I can help you.
Yeah. If there is some question, please bring to my notice, okay?
So
I don't see any question here till now, but
I
maybe you can ask.
If the speakers themselves want to ask questions, I think they can always ask the session speakers, but others, I think the audience, if you can type in your questions, I think we can, I can relay to Dr. Sharma.
Yeah, it's only 10 minutes time, so it is better to give some time to the audience because people have already spoken. I would prefer the audience to ask questions. If there is not much question, if not coming, then Sarala, if you have a question, yes, I can see a question here. Is there any policy framework developed for socio-ecological landscapes in Nepal? And the question is asked to Dr. Chaudhury.
Thank you so much. Actually, yes, Nepal government has been undertaking this parameter, socio-ecological landscapes in Nepal, and it has come up with some frameworks, yes, because we have been, as I mentioned to you, that we have been working in landscape level conservation, and there are 6 landscapes in Nepal. And when you see the coverage of the country, it comes more than 85%, 86%. So yes, frameworks have been developed, definitely. But that has to be more still to be vibrant and more effectively to be implemented. Thank you. If I made my points clear.
Yes, I think that was very clear. Yeah, I don't see any other questions coming. Oh, okay, there is another question coming. How do we look at the evolution of species to landscape level conservation? Where does transboundary approach fit in? So any of the speakers would like to give, there is no specific speaker identified. Maybe Professor Chaudhury, you have worked on from species to landscape and transboundary, so you may be the right person.
Yes, thank you. Evolution of species to landscape level conservation. Definitely, there could be some good examples of landscape evolution of a species at the landscape level. For example, in Kanchenjunga landscape, which shares Nepal, India, and Bhutan. So especially between Sikkim Himalaya and Nepal Himalaya, snow leopard. Snow leopard is a very good example, which moves from one country to another country. So this is one example. Another example, very interesting example, could be wild yak in Kailash sacred landscape. So evolution of a species in landscape level conservation is very, very important, and it is taking place also in Tarai Arc landscape. So we have a lot of movement of tigers and rhinoceros from one country to another. So those are some very good examples, I would say. Thank you.
I would also like to add here.
Yes, please. Yeah.
In Kanchenjunga landscape, so there is a yak.
Yeah.
So what has happened is that about almost more than 60 years ago, 50 years ago, 50, 60 years ago, when the borders were very much made strict. So the yaks from Tibet couldn't move to Bhutan, yaks from Tibet couldn't move to Sikkim, and then the situation, topographic situation in Nepal is also a little difficult in the Kanchenjunga landscape from the China side. So what has happened is that there is so much of inbreeding, and the yak were not able to have a good crossbreeding and evolution of species. So the transboundary approach here, I remember if Dr. Tasi from ISIMOD is listening, or Dr. Nakul Chetri or not, they introduced, and with the help of the government of Bhutan and with the help of government of Sikkim in India and government of Nepal, they were able to exchange the yak genetic resources to do the crossbreeding. So the transboundary approach is helping yak species. And if the yak is better, then the landscape, of course, management will be easier, because yak is a central species for livelihoods in high altitude pastoral lands. So this is how it has worked. So just to give you an example. Then let me give you another question, and it is from Sita Devi Sharma. And question is to Raman, Dr. Raman. I think Steve would like to know how zoom cultivation helps in increasing the bird number, because she says that till now not much is known of environmental damages causes on the bird species. Dr. Raman.
Yes, yeah, good question. I mean, when you think of zoom cultivation, there are two aspects. One is that, there is a lot of opinions related to zoom that comes from the colonial period, where the British foresters regarded this as a very harmful, destructive practice, and they wanted to sort of bring in regular forestry operations there for timber and for revenue. So that has carried on into the present day. So when we think of zoom, it's usually seen as a destructive practice. Now, when it comes to birds, it's very easy to say that zoom can have a destructive effect or reduce bird richness by comparing only areas which are under current cultivation. If you take an open zoom field and look at it, yes, it will have fewer bird species as compared to rainforest, but you need to have that whole landscape perspective. When you zoom out and look at the landscape, there are, for every hectare of zoom field, there are maybe 7 to 10 hectares in the landscape which are not under cultivation. They're rested and they are regenerating forests. And these regenerating patches are often very dense with bamboo and pioneer trees and others. And the zoom cultivators also retain bits of forest as part of the landscape. So when you have that landscape level view, you find that it actually sustains a lot of species of birds. In fact, it is much better than monoculture crops such as oil palm or teak. So that's what I would say. Never look only at just the cultivated field, zoom out and look at the whole cycle and how it transforms the landscape, which includes a lot of regenerating forest.
Okay, now we have last two questions, and I request now not others to write, but now let me put those two questions. One is by Abantika. If not by establishing PAs, then what is the fate of biodiversity out of existing PAs? How can they be managed, sustained? How can we not lose them in this era of Anthropocene? So please think who is going to answer this. Another question is by Basundhara Chetri to Dr. Ganesan. When lots of hybrid crops are introduced, you said that most of the crops in Himalaya are becoming wild relatives. How can you please explain? So after this, I'll try to summarize quickly. One is Dr. Ganesan. Can you go straight forward? And then I will see who is going to volunteer the first question.
Yes, Dr. Sharma, thank you. Basundhara Chetri is asking this question. Basically, I mentioned that every plant that is consumed in the form of wild plant looks like the crop wild relative. Really, crop wild relatives are independent of these hybrid crops, but whenever there is a need for us, in case of some crop disease resistance, some other better trait which we have to get it from the wild plants, that time we will be searching for these wild relatives, so that the hybrid or some plant improvement techniques we will be transferring nowadays. Most of them are based on the genetic tools. So still the wild crops or the crop wild relatives are very, very important, because they are in constant interaction with the environment, and then they keep on evolving. So whereas our crop plants are not provided that kind of opportunity, because we are restricting themselves in such a way that our breeding methods are not making the crops to evolve. Of course, we also talk about GMO crops and so many other things, but it is always better to have the repository of wild crop relatives in our forest or in the human dominated landscapes where they are in constant interaction with human use as well as with the nature. So it's very, very important to maintain our crop wild relatives in the more kind of protected areas that are facilitated by the communities.
Wonderful. Now let's have the answer for the last question. Who is going to come?
Yes,
Protected areas.
Yes, if I may do that. Yes,
Yes.
So this is very important thing to think, that if not even establishing protected areas, then what would be the fate of biodiversity outside existing protected area? There are several models, and we should learn from those models also. So let me give you here one example. Well, landscape approach is one, but another approach could be biosphere reserve. This biosphere reserve, for example, is occurring or taking place very effectively in Indian part of Kanchenjunga landscape, like Kanchenjunga National Park in India, which has three important conservation aspects. Like one is core zone where no activities are performed, then buffer zone where people live, and another one is transition zone where even to commercial aspects or industrialization is promoted. So that can be one important thing, and we wanted from Nepal, from our perspective, to convince Nepal government, and still we are doing that one. So if that kind of approach like biosphere reserve can be another very good option or complement for protected areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let me thank and summarize this very important session. First of all the speakers, Professor Ram Chaudhury, Dr. R. Ganesan, Dr. T.R. Shankaraman, and Dr. Lila Nath Sharma. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, very much timely and very matured. And your experience were very well reflected. And I think it has really given a very good overview on the biodiversity beyond protected areas and what are the new perspectives for conservation. So excellent. And all the questions raised by the audience were also very pertinent and very important, very good. Thank you, audience. We had very limited time of about 8-9 minutes very well. Now, a little bit of summarization. See, it's very difficult to summarize this 2 hours of presentation in 2 minutes. But what I'm going to do is I pick up 2 or 3. Dr. Sarala, are you saying something? It's okay. So I'm going to just pick up few highlights of each of the presentation. And from Professor Ram Chaudhury, I think what was very important, the key messages, I would say, biodiversity heritage. See, lots are there in the literature. We should not miss those literature very much. And then those heritages are going to be very, very useful in times to come. So that is a very important message that keeps on coming. Then he also gave a very good information. Biodiversity keeps the planet habitable. So that means the priority of the actions globally, even in for climate action, is to keep the planet viable, planet healthy, habitable. Then in that case, biodiversity has a major role to play. Then the symbolic uses of biodiversity when it comes for economic development. So many people use those biodiversity. I see Edelweiss flower even in the big restaurants. So he talked about red panda and others. So I think that is a very nice thing happening, but how to really keep track of that, and the benefit goes to the people who are conserving those species up in the nature, up in the mountains. So that is also important. A very important key message which was coming from him was biodiversity is the engine for most of ecosystem services. See, we have to understand, we talk about lots of ecosystem services like water, for soil erosion control, all those things we talk. But what is that which is making it happen? it is biodiversity. I think it's an engine for that, which was a clear message coming from him. And lastly, I think there are many things, invasive species, all those, but I think role of customary institutions are very important. And he gave an example of pastoral management. I think customary institutions are the social component of those socio-ecological landscapes. So in that, the social customary things should be really kept intact, and it needs to be moved forward. Now, the second talk by Dr. Ganesan, I think it is another very focused talk of wild relatives. And it was reminding me of my work that I was doing in Sikkim, Lars cardamom. We had Amomum subulatum, the cultivated Lars cardamom species, and it had 7 or 8 wild relatives. And can you imagine, even in the cultivated land, they would put 1 or 2, 3 plants of those wild relatives, so that there is some cross-pollination going on. So that was the custom, that was the thing. So slowly, those wild relatives are lost. And then all these diseases are coming, because that was also when I had gone in late 80s and early 90s, then those wild relatives were intact in many of the Lars cardamom gardens. So we worked also on wild edibles. I saw your slides where you are trying to sow avocado, which is a wild relative. So that was quite interesting. And wild edibles. So there are many wild edibles. They are unknown, and they're I think used for the future, which you were mentioning. If there is a genetic holocaust of certain crops, these crops may be very useful and can be brought upfront for meeting those challenges. So I really liked, and then you propose the conservation measures, which are quite interesting. Larger conservation effort is very much important and required if we have to really save these wild relatives and wild edible plants. So larger conservation is a big message. And you talked about wild biological sources. No, conservation of wild biological sources needs to be managed by multi-stakeholders, because it is outside. It is not a protected area managed by forest management or wildlife division, but it is by many communities, many societies. So multiple stakeholders, right from government to the people who take for the marketing the products, all of them have to be involved. So that was a very good message coming out of your talk, very much. And then you also talked about how crop wildlife species and wild edibles can be used and commercially used, and then do the conservation. So enterprise-based, community-involved, multi-stakeholder. So if all is done, then there is a commercial benefit, but also conservation benefit, and they remain intact. I think they were a wonderful talk. Thank you very much, Dr. Ganesan. Then the next talk was by Dr. Shankaraman, and people are calling him Raman, so that's fine. Easier to call. Dr. Raman, I think your presentation was another very interesting. You talked about Anamalai landscape, and very clearly your pictorial presentation of the rainforest fragment, then at the backside, then eucalyptus, then coffee in the corner, tea with some trees, and then degraded sites, roads and settlements. I think this is the type of mosaic landscape that we have.
I think we lost Dr. Sharma.
I think, yeah, he's shown there, but I think we are unable to hear him. Should I call him once?
Dr. Sharma is muted. Dr. Sharma, you're muted.
The organizers have to, yeah, now it's unmuted. I hope I said Anamalai landscape. Did you get that? And then you got disrupted. No?
Yes. Yes.
So that was excellent, I think. And then when you talked about this How does fragmentation affect bird richness and population? And then your slides very much showing coffee, two sites, one with multiple species, one with few dense species, shade species, and how the bird species are responding was excellent. I really enjoyed, and I think that was a clear message coming out from there. If you create a mosaic habitat of a real forest situation to a purely agriculture and in mixed situation where you can get the benefits of ecosystem services on one hand, like agroforestry, but on the other hand, the bird species richness and population is also increased and enhanced. And that will give a much more sustainability, habitat sustainability for any ecosystem when you have all these species together, because it is a multifunctionality of all these species together provides a stability and services. So excellent, very good presentation. And I also liked the Mizoram case where landscape modification is taking and there is post cultivation after Zoom slash and burn or after slash, then when it moves back to the forest, how the bird species are coming back. I think that was also a good story and good learning for young researchers to also focus and see. Your message of abundance declining in landscape was also a very critical one. I think we have to not only see which species, but what are the abundance of those species has to be also given importance in management and conservation. And finally, I think woody species contributes in the habitat to so lots of woody species. You have tea, but if you get the woody species, you have coffee, you get the woody species, you have diversity of woody species in agroforestry system. So that will provide opportunity for a number of birds to come. Avifauna will be very much addressed. I think wonderful, and I really enjoyed. See the diversity of talks. And the last one is by Dr. Lila Nath Sharma. It was excellent because when we were, he really stressed on the opportunities of protecting biodiversity outside protected areas. I think that was critical, clear message. There are many opportunities. And he mentioned 3 opportunities which Nepal officially, legally, they are put into policies and then it has practiced. So it is low intensity farms very much. And then community forests. It's a great example. I keep on showing that forest. It's a multi-stakeholders, all the peoples working right from the government policy chains to researchers to communities, everybody have contributed to bring the middle hills of Nepal back into a very rich green forest, from barren situation to a very rich forest. So in that context, community forest is a revolution in the world, and that's a very excellent example you presented. I'm very happy. In India also, community conserved areas are getting more and more importance, and you also mentioned about that. So that is yet a new coming approach, and it is globally recognized now. And then I think we have to really take opportunity of community conservation areas as the areas for protection by communities outside the formal government protected areas. So there were excellent messages from your side. You talked about biological invasion. And in biological invasion would be a big driver to really degrade the forest, really degrade the quality of landscapes. And in that context, I think the conservation is going to be a big impact. So in that context, how to really see the invasive species and how to really control that, and so that our landscapes have the integrity of the natural species rather than the invasive species, and move forward. I think these are the major, I think, key messages coming from the 4 presentations. I was thrilled to listen to all these eminent speakers, and I'm so happy that I was able to be part of this session. Although rather than chairing, I was more happy to listen. So finally, I would like to thank the organizers, Dr. Sarala Khaling and Dr. Bose Acharya, for giving me again this opportunity of chairing this session, which was a wonderful session. And I wish all the best to all the speakers, the audience, and also the organizers for coming out with a very good report and with the key messages, the way I tried to summarize, so that those key messages could be then put into the policy framework. With this, thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to get connected with many of you whom I knew very well and many of the new friends. Although we knew each other, like Dr. Ganesan was mentioning, we knew each other, but we had never seen our face to face. And today was a good opportunity. So I really enjoyed. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma, for such for chairing this session and for the insights that you've given, for the summing up and really doing it and making the whole session very, very interesting. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the speakers who brought out really very, very interesting and diverse talks. And all of them are eminent, and they've been working for such, I mean, they've devoted a large part of their lives working in whatever they were talking about today. So thank you very, very much. And this brings us to and I also would like to thank the audience for all the questions and the interactions that they've provided to us. So thank you so much. And I hope all of you all learned a lot. I did. And so thank you. And with this, we come to the end of the technical session 1. And then we break for about 15 minutes. So we are back at 3 o'clock with technical session 2, which is on the project itself, and which is the key ecosystem services and biodiversity components in socio-ecological landscapes in Darjeeling and Sikkim. And we would request many of you to stay and listen, especially because these will be presentations by our very young scholars, the future leaders in conservation and environment. So those of you who have the time, who can, please do stay back and listen to their talks also, very interesting talks. And the session will be chaired by Professor Shanti Swarup Sharma, who's a senior professor at the Department of Botany at Sikkim University. So we will see you all and back at 3 p.m. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.